Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I do believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. We have begun a series that I call the Boomer Beacon series, and I want to introduce you today to a guest you may be familiar with if you're regular listeners. He is none other than Douglas Brand, occasionally or over the years known or referred to as the Tower of London, maybe the Bobby of Baghdad, and currently an Oxford Don. As a career British police officer, all 6 feet 9 inches of him, he shares his various jobs and lessons learned from a colorful and distinguished career lasting, hope you don't mind me saying this, it's true, over 50 years. And yes, he did start early on the international stage, and he's not done yet. So welcome, Douglas Brand.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
Well, thank you. So, okay, we let the cat out of the bag. You started early and jumped right into a career that lasted for several decades. What influenced you to go into your career, and share with us what it was?
I think initially, as the eldest of 6 boys, there was an automatic responsibility thrust on me that was continued into school, where in the UK we have a system of prefects, which are like sort of monitors, monitoring fellow pupils on behalf of the staff. So it wasn't unusual for me to think about going into a career that had similar sorts of responsibilities. And actually, I joined the police as a cadet, the London Metropolitan Police as a cadet in 1968. Then I joined the police proper in 1970 and haven't looked back.
So pray tell, what were some of your early experiences? And I think we have to include in here, you have to tell us how tall a bobby hat is, which then would be added to your 6'9" height. And I think that played into a couple of your experiences with your encounters you've had over the years too.
Indeed. I mean, there are some disadvantages of being my height, and with a bobby helmet on, it puts me at about 7'3". Because those who've sometimes in some of the livelier parts of London who've had a little to drink always think that they can take on, somebody of my size. So often they were tiny little people as well, and it was rather irritating. But there we are. I suppose really, the thing that got me into almost a career-long association with things like crises and disaster and terrorism were my earliest examples. I think I was only in the police about 3 months when I was part of a group that had to go and try and sort out a problem in the Jordanian embassy, where a group called the Free Palestine Guerrillas had taken it over. It's one of the things I found throughout my career, that other people's problems in other people's countries often visited themselves on the streets of London because they had an embassy or some other representation. But on this particular one, my boss asked me to go in and climb through a window to try and find out what was going on, and go in with an official from the embassy. And basically they found me. We had a bit of a battle on the stairway, and eventually cleared them out. But on the back page of the newspaper the next day, the first person out of the window was the embassy official I'd originally gone in with, who managed to get himself into the room round the room into the ideal position to jump out of the window as soon as the police sort of came through the door. So that was my first example. Then very shortly after that, so still a very young officer, I walked into a building shop on Kensington High Street. Kensington is a smart part of London. The shop was called Beavers, and a bomb went off. And so that was my introduction to terrorism. That was an organisation known as the Anger Brigade, which was a precursor to the IRA bombings that we had. And so for the next decade or so, my life was woven into various threats and bombings that went on in London.
Now, as I recall, until recent times, most street bobbies or constables didn't even carry weapons, except you had a truncheon or a baton, as you call it, or a baton tucked in your breeches. So how did you actually deal with all these terrorist threats and the scuffles you're talking about?
Well, it's traditional for the British police to be unarmed. Not the case so much these days, although it's still the case that the police are not routinely armed, but we do have capacities to respond to incidents involving firearms or explosives. But I was one of the few, particularly young constables, who actually did carry a gun, because after the incident I mentioned at the Jordanian embassy and a shooting that took place there, we had to provide armed protection, and I suddenly had to be trained, and I maintained that for quite some years through my early career. But for the most part, we police with our sort of method of talking rather than resorting to an array of weapons. And it's only in latter years that the development of things like pepper spray and taser has found itself into the police in the UK. Up until the time I left, it was still the wooden baton in the trousers, in the pants.
Yeah. But I have to say, from all your colleagues I've met over the years, including yourself, that talking ability, which is highly diplomatic, highly skilled in negotiation, empathy, strategic thinking, psychology, all of that. It would be sad for me if it were a lost art. Does that continue even though you may be armed, or does the current sort of marketplace or culture and not allow for that to happen because people just are too quick to whip out a weapon?
I think the policing, policing is always potentially dangerous simply because you're in a potentially confrontational situation with situations that people call your attention to. Often it's the case that the police are called when normal methods for resolving an issue have failed. I often used to say to my officers that, you join the police to deal with the grey areas of society, so don't start looking for black and white answers. And part of not looking for black and white answers is understand what's going on, communicate effectively, de-escalate the problem, manage the conflict without necessarily resorting to force. Although obviously force is something that can be applied when it's appropriate.
Okay, so any particular strong lessons from that period before you moved on to a different department in the police service?
Well, I think one of the things that I was quite surprised at, and particularly in relation to the bombings I spoke about, is how quickly the public gets behind you and sort of falls into line in terms of the behaviour that we would want for them to, for instance, checking not leaving their suitcases around, checking baggages and that sort of thing. That became quite a common way of operating. Of course, that's the plus side. The downside is that what you ideally want in a democracy is people not to be fearful. So the very origin of the word terrorism comes from terror, and the idea of any group that's involved in terrorism is to do exactly that, to generate fear and create terror. So part of the lesson learned there was to first of all get my officers well equipped to be able to manage these sorts of scenarios, often with very difficult circumstances to negotiate, but also to enlist the cooperation, collaboration of members of the public.
Mm. So you moved on from there then to traffic policing. Any adventures of particular note?
Well, actually, traffic took place, traffic policing, which was, if you can imagine the scenario, me on a white motorcycle tearing around central London, happened quite early on in my service as a young constable. But it happened at a time where, again, the terrorism was picking up. So a lot of our time as central London motorcyclists was dealing with either the immediate aftermath of bomb explosions or trying to divert traffic away from where there was a potential for some incident to occur.
And as I recall, you also were involved in racing motorcycles for the police. So did that sort of add to the thrill factor for you buzzing around London? I found myself, and I'm sure one of your questions will be around, how do you move on to different jobs and that sort of thing. I had a phone call on one occasion from somebody who said, we need some new instructors at the police driving school. Are you interested? And having been a motorcycle cop, I thought, well, yeah, this sounds good. And whilst I was there, I just happened to be there at a time where there was a great interest, the instructors on the motorcycle ring are getting involved in off-road racing. And so they sort of recruited me into their team. And I found myself racing in international events, not particularly successfully, but racing in international events held in different parts of the UK, which were, quite exciting. And it wasn't something that I think I was built for, but nevertheless, it was good fun. And people from all around the world are fascinated by British royal family. So didn't you also have a few rescues or incidences where you helped out the royal family as a traffic cop?
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to avoid them sometimes because with the exception of the Queen and her immediate family, most of the other members of the royal family sort of move around incognito. So sometimes you come across them in the most bizarre of places. And on one occasion, I was in absolute downpour of rain, and there was a car parked in the outside lane. So I thought, right, the best thing to do, because it was holding up all the rush hour traffic, was to get it to the side. So I just sort of shouted to the driver, steer to the left, I'll stop the traffic, I will push the car and aim it for that little refuge area off the main road, which is what we did. And I went back and got my bike, and the water by this time was pouring down the back of my neck. And I went across and went on the passenger side, so I was out of the traffic, and talked across the passenger to the driver saying, okay, so who are you? Where are you going to? Are you a member of AAA? That sort of thing. And the two looked at one another, and the driver introduced me to a member of the royal family who was about sort of 6 inches from my dripping helmet. And said that they'd been awfully naughty and they'd left their protection officers behind whilst they were doing